It's really interesting to read about the history of different political ideologies, the past of these ideologies, their present, and their future. It's really interesting to see how these political movements have grown, adapted, evolved, and developed over time in relation to other ideologies as well as in relation to the external world and changes and events in it. One of the more interesting ones of these to read, their history and their trajectory, is nationalism. Now, just to put out there, I am not a nationalist and I don't really agree with much of what nationalism has to say, but I do take it as an important political ideology, especially since the Enlightenment era and in modernity. It has good things about it, it has bad things about it. One of the really interesting things, though, about nationalism is its history. In other words, one can say or argue that nationalism is the dark horse of the political spectrum. What do I mean by that? Nationalism is the dark horse of the political spectrum insofar as it begun as, ironically enough and funnily enough, a left wing ideology, a left wing kind of movement that was based on the scientific outlook of the Enlightenment project and was considered a sort of progressive ideology in comparison to the other conservative ideologies that were present when it first arose. However, it gradually became a right wing movement. Nowadays, we often associate nationalism with a somewhat militaristic, somewhat ethnic, ethnic, sort of ethnocentric, somewhat, exclusionary ideology that produces this kind of us and them narrative. Of course, the value that people often see in nationalism and the reason why they turn to it is they see the value of a shared identity, a shared ethnicity, a shared culture, and they value their heritage. And of course, whilst it's important to be patriotic and proud of one's own legacy and traditions and heritage, nationalism often devolves into something much worse. It can often be quite exclusionary. It can come at the cost of other groups. It can create hatred and mistrust between different groups and often cause conflict between them. We see how this kind of ultra nationalism led to World War One in Europe. These highly nationalistic nations wanted to go at each other, and all it took was one spark to just ignite the whole inferno and lead to 4 years of war. We also saw this kind of ultra nationalism in the Yugoslavia civil strife or civil war of the 90s and early 2000s, where ultra nationalistic militias committed war crimes against various different ethnic groups and populations. And we also see this kind of ultra nationalism, as I talked recently in one of my earlier videos, in the Indian subcontinent right now, especially between Pakistan and India. So, studying the trajectory that nationalism has gone through is really interesting and it's really important to understanding our current world as well. Nationalism was, of course, like I said, initially based on the values of the Enlightenment project. It emphasized that citizens or subjects within a nation state, which is, by the way, a modern construct, the nation state didn't really exist pre modernity, that in the nation state, its organization ought to be based on a group of people that have a shared ethnicity, shared culture, shared language, etc. These people were endowed with basic inalienable rights, basic human liberties and freedoms. They, of course, had responsibilities towards the greater state, and they would be working for the good of the nation. Of course, one can see how this kind of thinking was, of course, left wing or more progressive compared to the other conservative ideologies of the time, which were often monarchy based, nobility based, hereditary based. And obviously, in reaction and in comparison to, let's say, the monarchy and nobility of France or the various monarchies across Europe, this nationalistic ideology would be much more left wing, much more egalitarian compared to all of these. Yet nationalism, of course, had within it the seeds necessary to become a right wing ideology. The emphasis on a shared heritage and history of a people's meant that it had to adopt, or it had to at least accept and tolerate certain traditions which, according to Enlightenment philosophers, would be considered as superstitious and backwards and irrational. Religion, which of course many Enlightenment thinkers may not have particularly liked, and would have to accept even the clergy, let's say. or not accept the clergy, but at least tolerate it as an important group of people that existed within a nation's history. Initially, nationalism was rather anti clerical, yet over the coming decades, this kind of mistrust between nationalists and the clergy somewhat dissolved, insofar as, of course, it's not an outright part of any nationalist's agenda right now to attack a cleric or a religious scholar for the sake of it, or because inherently they view them as evil or bad or misleading people. Over time as well, nationalism became associated with this kind of romantic militarism and also this kind of romanticization of the past, of past legacy, of past history. And this combination of militarism and nationalism, alongside this kind of exclusionary narrative that was fostered by nationalism, the us and them, in group and out group dynamic, led to nationalism eventually becoming a far more right wing conservative ideology than it initially began as. It's interesting then to see that perhaps in the 1800s, nationalism may have been a left wing progressive ideology, but in the 2000s, so to speak, nationalism is now a conservative right wing ideology. It's also important to note, though, that nationalism is generally never taken as an ideology in and of itself. As Eric Hobsbawm, the author of The Age of Empire, asserts, nationalism is generally drunken, or it's necessarily taken as a cocktail, in other words, in tandem with one or more different ideologies. This is because nationalism obviously talks and discusses the organization of a nation state, what the role of the nation state is, what the organization of it should be based on, but it doesn't necessarily address certain economic issues, and there's often room for interpretation of how to apply a nationalistic cause. Therefore, you see different versions of nationalism or interpretations of it, such as nationalistic socialism, religious nationalism, conservative nationalism, progressive nationalism, anti-colonial, third way socialist nationalism, all of these different kind of nationalist movements arising throughout the world, which uniquely blend different kind of ideologies together alongside nationalism, therefore creating this nationalistic cocktail to be drunk from. Hence, we can see that nationalism is a pretty versatile ideology, all things being considered. It's often worked in tandem with different ideologies, and it often acts as a dark horse of the political spectrum, where relative to different ideologies, it can either be a conservative right wing force, so to speak, or a left wing progressive force, so to speak.